Alright, we are going to start with 1. Again, this is section 10.4, where we're doing introducing our 3 other trig functions, which is basically the reciprocal of sine, cosine, and tan, that being cosecant, secant, and cotangent. Okay, let's start with number 1. Number 1 says we want to find the values of the following: secant, cosecant, and cotangent. Okay, let's go ahead and start with A. For A, it says cosine is equal to 4 over 5, and our theta is acute. Okay, what that means is, if it's acute, we already know it's going to be in Q1. Okay, because an acute angle is between 0 and 90. Okay, now it's given us adjacent and hypotenuse. That's what I've put here. And our opposite side would have to be 3, based upon Pythagorean theorem. Alright, so what I recommend you doing is basically, what I want you to do is go ahead and define what sine is, define what cosine is, and define what tangent is. Because once we have these, we can basically find our 3 other trigonometric ratios. So sine is opposite over hypotenuse, which ends up being 3 over 5. Cosine we already have, that was 4 over 5. And tangent, that is opposite over adjacent, which is 3 over 4. So, with this being said, I can find the other values, which are sines. Sines reciprocal, okay, would be cosecant. Cosine, that would be secant. And then tangent's inverse would be cotangent. Okay, let's start with secant. So with secant, we have 3 over 5. Again, the inverse of that would be 5 over 3. The inverse of cosine would be 5 over 4. And finally, tangent, the inverse of that would be 4 over 3. Okay, so here are the following answers. Alright, letter B, we have tangent, which is equal to negative 3 over 4. And we know that theta is reflexive. Let me explain this. What this is saying, reflexive, means it's between 180 and 360. So theta, so you shouldn't have included. Theta should be between 180 and 360. Okay, that's what reflex means. So with that being said, let's create our diagram. Okay, now I know it's going to be either in Q3 or Q4. Okay, because again, that's where this stands. How do I know whether it's Q3 or Q4? Well, this will also give me hints. Tangent is negative, and where is tangent negative? Tangent has to be negative in Q4. Okay, so again, this is theta. I know negative 3 over 4, that's opposite over adjacent, 3 and 4. Okay, and I know that this, our 3 would have to be negative. Based upon Pythagorean theorem, I can find my missing side, my hypotenuse, which is just 5. Okay, so now I can start stating what sine, cosine, and tangent is. Okay, so sine, theta, cosine, theta, and tangent theta. Alright, so sine theta. Sine theta is opposite over hypotenuse. That would mean that this is negative 3 over 5. Cosine theta, that would end up being 4 over 5. Tangent, that's opposite over adjacent, that's negative 3 over 4. Alright, again, let's start with that, and then we can find the inverse of each of these. That would mean cosecant, that would mean secant, and finally cotangent. Okay, so here's the easy part. Now all we have to do is flip it, 5 over 3, or negative 5 over 3, 5 over 4, and then negative 4 over 3. Okay, so that's the answer for letter B. Alright, I'm just going to do one more. Okay, I'm going to do letter C. Okay, so letter D you can look up on your worksheet or on the key. So for C, we know it's hypotenuse, so it's going to end up in Q2. Okay, opposite over hypotenuse, that would mean hypotenuse is 2, opposite being 1, and we have square root of 3 for our adjacent side. Okay, we know that this is going to be negative. And now let's go ahead and state sine, cosine, and tangent. Sine would end up being, again, that's given, 1 over 2. Cosine is a negative square root of 3 over 2. Tangent would end up being negative 1 over square root of 3. Alright, we're going to find the inverses of each, which would mean that they are the following: cosecant, they are secant, and tangent versus cotangent. Alright, cosecant. Again, find the inverse. That would be positive 2. Cosine's cosine's inverse is secant. Okay, I'm going to already put this in rational form. Okay, I'm going to rationalize this already. When you rationalize this, you should end up with negative 2 square root of 3 over 3. Okay, cotangent, that should end up being square root of 3. Okay, so those are your answers for 1A, 1B, and 1C. 1D you can look up on your key. Alright, number 2. Given that tan theta is equal to negative 2, and tan and cosine have the opposite signs, find the value of the following. So you can do this in one big swoop, as long as you make a diagram. Let's find out where tan theta negative 2 should be. Now it does say tan and cosine have opposite signs. Okay, so we got to determine where it should be. Again, everything's positive there. Sine's positive right there. Tan is positive there, and cosine's positive there. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and determine this. Now I know tan and cosine have opposite signs, so it can't be Q1. Can't be Q2 because tan and cosine would be negative there. Can't be Q3. Why? Now tan and cosine have opposite signs there. However, if you take a look here, tan is negative, right? So tan in Q3 is positive. So the only option we have is in Q4. Okay. So again, make your reference angle. Here's my right angle, and start labeling your sides. Opposite over adjacent. That would mean that is 2, and that is 1. Okay. Now your 2 would actually be negative since it's going down. Okay. Once you do Pythagorean theorem, you will end up getting square root of 5 here. So I can start determining what A, what B, and what C is. First of all, cotangent is pretty easy to get because tan was given to you earlier. The reciprocal of negative 2 would be negative 1 over 2. Okay. Letter B asks for sine theta. Well, sine theta would end up being opposite over a hypotenuse, which is negative 2 over square root of 5. Once you rationalize it, you should end up with negative 2 times square root of 5 over 5. Okay? And letter C, it's asking you secant. And again, what I like for you to do when you start getting these inverse functions is find out what the inverse of secant is, right? The inverse of secant is simply just cosine. So find out what cosine is first, and then finding secant would be even easier. So find cosine. Cosine would end up being adjacent over hypotenuse. That's 1 over square root of 5. And you know that secant is going to be the complete opposite. It's going to be the inverse of that. So it's simply just square root of 5. Okay? So here's A, B, and C. Alright, number 3. Number 3 has secant theta is equal to 3, and theta is acute. So we already know it is going to be in Q1. So, alright, we are given secant. Remember what secant actually is. Secant is just the inverse of cosine. Okay, so that 3 turns into 1 over 3, which is adjacent over hypotenuse. Okay, you can think of secant as hypotenuse over adjacent. Okay, so cosine, let's go ahead and label our sides. That's adjacent over hypotenuse. That means 1, 3, and we're going to end up having square root of 8 as our other leg. Okay, so our diagram is ready to go. We can go ahead and start answering some of these questions. First of all, it does ask us what cosine is, and again, that is the inverse of secant, so that should be pretty easy to get. That's simply just 1 over 3. B asks us to find cosecant. Now again, what I like for you to do first is find the inverse of cosecant. That would be sine. Just ask yourself, what is sine here? Right? What is sine in that diagram? It's opposite over hypotenuse. Well, that would end up being square root of 8 over 3, which means cosecant would end up being the complete opposite, which is just 3 over square root of 8. Now you're going to have to rationalize here. Okay? Once you rationalize, you should end up with 3 square root of 8 over 8. Okay? So there's A, there's B, and finally C. Tan 90 minus theta. Alright. So tan, again, we should be pretty good at this now. Tan 90 minus theta is simply, again, that angle is 90 minus theta. That's opposite over adjacent, which means that's 1 over square root of 8. However, you want to rationalize it, so it should be square root of 8 over 8, and that is letter C. Alright, number 4. Cotangent theta is equal to negative 1 over square root of 2. Theta is obtuse. So right off the bat, we know it's going to be in Q2. Okay? Alright. So, again, you can either label tangent, you can find the tangent of this, or the inverse of that, or you can simply just say O over, tangent's O over A, this should be A over O, which helps you to determine the sides. Our adjacent side is 1. Our opposite side is square root of 2. Okay? Make sure you don't forget about 1 should be negative. Once you do Pythagorean theorem, you should end up with square root of 3 there. Okay? So, let's go ahead and find out what tangent theta actually is. Okay. Well, A is asking us to do tangent negative theta. Okay, now let me actually redraw this because it might help out for us to determine what this is. I'm going to erase this in a second. Okay, now look, if tangent theta, or in this case, if cotangent theta is going in a positive direction like this, sorry, like this, stops right there, then negative theta is going to go in the opposite direction. So instead of going positive, it's going to go negative. So it's going to end up right here. So your right triangle should develop in Q3, okay, where this is negative theta. Okay, so if you ask yourself, well, what is that as negative theta? What are the ratios for negative theta? That would end up being negative square root of 2. That would be square root, hypotenuse is square root of 3, and we have negative 1. And now finding tangent negative theta is pretty easy. You just do opposite over adjacent. Opposite over adjacent would just end up being square root of 2. Okay, so again, take a look at where this is at initially, and then simply go in the other direction, just in a negative direction this time. So that's what A is. Let us go ahead and find out B. So for B, it's simply asking us secant theta. Okay, so we can go back to the original diagram. Secant theta, again, remind yourself what secant actually is. Secant is simply just the inverse of cosine. So maybe it'll help you to find what cosine theta is first before you tell me what secant is. Cosine theta, again, according to this diagram, is adjacent over hypotenuse. That would mean negative 1 over square root of 3. Okay, so finding secant is pretty easy, right? You just take the opposite of that. So secant is just negative square root of 3. Okay. For letter C, again, it's asking you cosecant 90 minus theta. Okay, so again, here's where my 90 minus theta is. Okay, again, it helps to ask yourself what the inverse of cosecant is. So what you're actually determining is sine of 90 minus theta, which would end up being opposite over hypotenuse. So that would mean negative 1 over square root of 3. Okay, which just ends up being, for cosecant, which just ends up being negative square root of 3. Okay, as you can tell, B and C are the same thing. Okay, remind yourself why that is. Okay, cosecant, and remember, sine 90 minus theta. That's one of the identities we learned earlier in the year. Alright, number 5. Number 5, we're simply stating the quadrants in which the theta must lie. So let's go ahead and make our diagram. Remind yourself, everything's positive there. Sine is positive there. Tan is positive there, and cosine is positive in Q4. Okay. Now, once you know that, this should be pretty easy. Okay. Cotangent. Where is cotangent? Negative. Okay. Cotangent would be negative in Q2 or Q4. So that would be Q2. And Q4. Cosecant, where is cosecant positive? Okay, it's going to be positive, everything is positive in Q1. It's also going to be positive, again, where sine is as well, so Q2. Secant and cosecant, where do they have the same sign? This is going to end up being Q1 and Q3. And D, where is cotangent and secant? Where do they have opposite signs? Okay, that will end up being Q3 and Q4. Alright, number 6. I'm not going to be able to do all these, but I'll do some of these so it gives you a gist of what this all is about. It's something you've done before, except again now these are inverse functions of sine, cosine, and tan. Okay, so again, I can't do all of these, but if you have a question, you can either ask me or go to the key. First one is cosecant x is equal to -2. Again, you want to find the degree associated with cosecant having a ratio of -2/1. Okay. Now, these inverse functions, what I would encourage you to do is put this in a form that is much more comfortable for you. So, if I'm putting this in sine, well, that will end up looking like -1/2. Okay, and this one, this trig function or this trig ratio, you should be pretty comfortable with because you can simply just get this from your unit circle. Okay, so the angles associated with -1/2 are going to be 210 degrees and also 330 degrees as well. Okay, so those are your two answers for A. Alright, B has 3 times cotangent of x is equal to 4. Again, cotangent x has to be by itself, so I'm going to divide by 3. You're going to end up with cotangent x is equal to 4/3. Okay, but again, put this in terms of tangent, right? So if I put this in terms of tangent, tangent x is equal to, well, the inverse of that, which is 3/4. Now this is something you've done before, right? You can do shift and tan. We're going to end up with tan -1, and you're going to simply put 3/4. It'll give you an angle associated with that. Okay. Your base angle, in this case, your base angle ends up being 37 degrees. Okay. Now remember, where is tan positive? That's going to be in Q1. It's also going to be in Q3. Okay. So off to the side, I know it's going to be in Q1, right here, and then also Q3. You also know it has a base angle of 37. Well, 37 degrees here and 37 degrees here. You can find your two angles, okay, which again is 37 and also 180 plus 37, which ends up being 217. Okay, so here are your two angles associated with cotangent 4/3. Okay, but you put it in terms of tan, so you can actually find the angle associated with that ratio. Alright, C. For C, we have secant x is equal to 5 times sine 20 degrees. Okay. So you see two trig functions here. One of them happens to be sine 20 degrees, which, again, you just want the ratio associated with 20 degrees. So you can simply just put that in your calculator. Okay. Once you put that in your calculator, you end up getting a value for this of 0.342. Again, you have to use a calculator. There's no way to do it without a calculator. Times 5 is equal to secant x. 5 times 0.342 ends up being secant x is equal to 1.71. Okay, and again, put this in terms of something that you're more comfortable with. or I mean, basically something you could actually plug in your calculator. Secant inverse is cosine. And again, what do you have to do with this? You have to find the inverse of that, so 1 over 1.71. Okay? So, again, you're going to go into your calculator, you're going to do shift, cosine, and cosine inverse is going to pop up, and you can find the angle associated with that. Okay, once you do that, you'll find out the angle associated with this is 54.2 degrees. Okay? That is also your base angle. Okay? And again, remind yourself, 1 over 1.71, so this, where is that positive for cosine? It's going to be positive in Q1. It's also going to be positive in Q4. Okay? So make your quick little sketch. I know it's going to be positive in Q1. Also, Q4, I know I have a base angle of 54.2, and I know my angles are going to be the following. They're going to be 54.2, obviously, and they're also going to be 360 minus 54.2, which ends up being 305.2. Sorry, 0.8. Alright? Alright, letter D, we have the following. Cotangent, except this is negative x, or negative theta. It's going to go in the opposite direction. 2 plus cosine 165 degrees. Alright, so cosine, let's end up doing this first. Cosine of 165 degrees. Again, we need a calculator for that. That's going to end up being negative 0.9659. Okay. Plus 2. Well, that's going to end up being basically 1.03. Okay, so I know cotangent of negative x is equal to 1.03. Now, let's put this in terms of tan. That would be tangent of negative x is equal to 1 over 1.03. Okay? So, a couple things here. You gotta ask yourself, okay, so let's go ahead and find the angle associated with this. Okay, so if I go ahead and do shift tan, and then do 1 divided by 1.03, I will find out that the angle associated with this is equal to approximately 44 degrees. Okay, so I know that at least, right? Again, where is this? Where is tan positive? That's going to be in Q1. It's also going to be in Q3. Okay. All right. However, notice this is a negative theta, so it's going to go in the opposite direction. So I'm going to actually draw a couple of models here. The first model, okay, represents a positive theta. Okay, so this is just tan with a positive theta. Okay, that's going to go in Q1, right? It's also going to go in Q3, where it's going to go this way and then end up here. Okay, now again, I have to go in the opposite direction here, so I'm going to recreate my diagram, but I know it's going to go in the opposite direction. Okay, so instead of going in Q1, it's going to go in the opposite direction to Q2. So I know one of my angles is going to be right there. And again, the other angle, it's going to go in the opposite direction. Notice this went to Q3. I have to go in the opposite direction now, where it'll go in the same value, just in the opposite direction. So it's going to end up in Q2. Okay? And again, remind yourself, I have a base angle of 44 degrees. So this has to be 44. This also has to be 44. Okay? Now you can help determine what those angles actually should be. Right? So one of those angles, right? Let's talk about the one in Q4. That should be 360 minus 44. So that angle ends up being 316 degrees. That's one answer. The one in Q2, again, let's do 180 minus 44. That will end up being 136. Okay, that's your other answer. Okay, guys, I'm going to stop right there for at least for number 6. You can go look up the other questions in on Google Classroom under the key. Okay, but I'm going to go ahead and move on from this section. Alright, number 7, last one. So without using a calculator, evaluate the following. First one we're going to do is secant 60 degrees. Okay, so again, I would encourage you to start developing your diagram so you can have in this case, a 30, 60, 90. Remind yourself, 30, 60, 90, across from 30 is 1, across from 60 is square root of 3, and your hypotenuse will end up being 2. Okay? So, secant 60. I would encourage you to find what cosine 60 is, because that's the inverse of secant. Cosine 60 would end up being A over H, which would mean that's 1 over 2. So that means secant 60 is just the inverse of that, which is just 2. Let's do letter B. We've got cosecant and negative 30 degrees, so we're going backwards. So I want to go negative 30 degrees. That means this is a base angle of 30, 60, and 90. That means that this is 1, square root of 3, and 2. Again, remind yourself this should actually be a negative 1. Alright, so cosecant. What is cosecant in terms of this? Well, find what sine is first, and then you can help determine what cosecant is. Sine in this case is just negative 1 over 2. That means cosecant would just be the inverse, which is just negative 2. Okay, so these are pretty easy. We've done these before. It's just... Alright, letter C. We have cotangent of 45. That's going to be in Q1. I have 1, and square root of 2. So again, this is cotangent. Find what tangent is first, and then you can find the inverse. Tangent of 45, that's going to be over A, which is 1 over 1. So cotangent is just the inverse, which is simply 1. Okay, so it's the same thing. Let us go ahead and finalize this. I'm going to do letter D, and then you can look up E and F on your key. Okay. I don't like that. Okay. Secant 150. Okay, I'm going to go around 150 degrees. That means this way. I'm going to stop right there. And I'm going to have my angle of 150 degrees. Okay. An angle of 150 degrees leaves a base angle of 30. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and put in my ratios. 1 square root of 3 and 2. This one should be negative. Okay, tell yourself what tell yourself what cosine 150 is first. And again, you can actually get this from your unit circle, but might as well do it by drawing it out too. Cosine 150 ends up being negative square root of 3 over 2, which means that secant 150 is negative 2 over square root of 3. But once you rationalize this, you should end up with negative 2 square root of 3 over 3. So here's your answer. Okay, guys. For the rest of these problems, you can look it up on the key. Okay, but that'll finalize this 10.4 lesson for today.